After his first encounter with cattle during his own lobola negotiations, Gregory decided to embark on a personal journey to explore kraals, rangelands and feedlots across South Africa to find out more about the national hunger for cows. He details his journey in a debut book he titled Wanted Dead and Alive, The Case for South Africa's Cattle. Well, Gregory is joining us from our Seapoint studio this morning to help us unpack his offering. Greggy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to come. I'd like for you to quickly take us back to the moment where your fascination for cattle was ignited.
Well, I moved to this country from the UK in the mid-90s, and I married a Zulu woman from KwaMashu, and I was informed that I had to come up with a cow to start the negotiations in order to marry her. So as a suburban Brit, I hadn't had much to do with cattle before then, but I think that was the start of it. And then later on, I became aware of Nguni cattle, and I saw we saw together a wonderful movie about Nguni cattle that was all evocative and set in rural KwaZulu-Natal, and the horns of cattle at dawn. And we came out of the movie and into a superette and saw this pile of polony, pink polony. And then it came to me in a flash that spectrum from Nguni to polony, you could tell a story about South Africa.
And so, Greg, what are some of the interesting facts that blew your mind as you went about uncovering and researching and finding more and more out about cattle and cows in particular?
Well, I found it was the subject that just kept giving. When I went into the history, I found this history of when the Europeans first came here, there was cattle they wanted from the Khoi people, this history of the cattle killings of non-Kause, how cattle interconnected with land reform and the challenges of land. And then I came to understand the science a bit more and see how cattle can help rebuild South Africa's degenerated soils that have been destroyed by centuries of inappropriate farming. But then also the challenges around methane and climate breakdown, and trying to understand, is there really still a place for cattle in this country?
You also write that South Africans love their cattle dead and alive. What do you mean by this?
Well, what I mean is that when I went up to rural KwaZulu-Natal or into the Eastern Cape, for example, people really want their cattle alive, as many as they can have as possible. And there may be commercial farmers who say, you've got too many cattle, there's too many for this land, you're degrading the soil, but they want those cattle alive. They see the value of them in them being alive. And then you look at the commercial farming model in beef, where the value of the cow is when it dies, and when you butcher it up and sell it up into styrofoam trays. And that's the dominant financial model for cattle in this country. So that was just one of the ways in which South Africa want their cattle alive and dead.
And what would you say are perhaps some of the questions that you still need to explore and find the answers to? What are some of the questions that you still perhaps need to do some work on in this journey?
I think I found nobody had done this before, and I would say that, if anything, I've maybe written the first words on the subject, but certainly not the last words. There's still lots more to explore. I found out about this fascinating Australian research that shows if you feed cattle seaweed, they emit less methane. So I'd like to know more about that. I'd like to know more about how we can change land ownership patterns in this country so that something between communal farming and large-scale commercial farming that can provide a space for us to have fewer cattle but in better conditions that give us meat that nourishes us in ways that sustain the planet. I think there's still lots more to be learned about that.
And we know that cows really do play a big role in African heritage, and just outside of that connection with the people and the land, what else would you say you learned in this regard when you were doing your research?
It was a huge education for me. I knew from my wedding and my life with my wife that cattle are important ancestrally in lots of African cultures, but I hadn't gone so deeply into it as when I started researching this book and understood the multitude of connections between cattle and people living and passed on. And understanding this rich narrative of connections, I feel that even though I went pretty deeply into it, I think there's so much more. It was vast. In fact, one could wander in that territory for a lifetime.
Now, you know, when one really digs into this book, you can tell that a lot of work and a lot of research has gone into what you write about and some of the things that you uncovered during that process. I mean, you say you were surprised that a book like this had not been written before. You had no anchor, no starting point. So perhaps take us through just some of the things, your research tools and some of the people that you had to speak to and places that you had to go to in order for that to culminate in this book.
Well, it took 10 years, which is a crazily long time, I guess, for a book. But as a result, I was able to wander all over the country and into Namibia and into Swaziland. And I was trying to look at the history of it, so I went deep into the research, the politics of it. So I talked to people involved in land reform, academics, politicians, civil society, into the culture of it. So from the industrial farmers into the supermarkets, the abattoirs, the wholesalers, and then in the communal side, up into the rural areas. I wanted to know more about Nguni cattle, spoke to people who are specialists about that. I mean, I'm a journalist by trade, and it was just a real pleasure to go really deeply into a subject. And as I went more and more deeply into it, I just found the subject became richer and richer. And it was just and unlike often in journalism where people don't really want to talk about the thing you are trying to ask them about, especially in politics, when it came to cattle, everyone wanted to talk and they were proud of what they had to say, and that was wonderful.
All right, Gregory, thank you so much for your insights and thank you so much for writing this great book. I'm pretty sure we'll see more of your work in the near future. That was journalist, researcher and writer Gregory Mthembu-Salter, and he's been speaking to us about his first book titled Wanted Dead and Alive, The Case for South Africa's Cattle. Well, if you also belong to a book club or you are perhaps a lone reader, you can also join us for our Sunday morning book feature to talk about some of the books that you're currently reading or have read. Just send us a detailed description of your book club on email, or you can drop us either a WhatsApp or a tweet or a Facebook message with a picture of those books and a brief caption using those different social media platforms. At Morning Live SABC, so you can find us on Twitter. Our Facebook page is Morning Live SABC, and of course you can drop us an email, morninglive@sabc.co.za. We'll take a quick break. We'll bring you more when we return.